I'm talking today to Sam Reeder, who is a PhD student in physics at my old university itself at UCL. And Sam has come through the academic world and done an integrated master's and is now doing PhD. And I thought I'd introduce him to you and get him to tell us something about what life is like as a PhD student and what the transition from master's to PhD is like, and maybe some advice that he can provide to other people who are simply thinking of making that similar transition. So, Sam, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you for agreeing to appear on this podcast.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's good to speak to you again.
Sam, tell us something about yourself insofar as how did you come to end up doing a PhD in physics? What attracted you to that particular area?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I can't remember a time where I haven't been interested in physics in some capacity or another. But the PhD came from sort of a decision I made in my second or third year of university. I did a PhD, sorry, I did a degree in physics for a different reason. It wasn't because I wanted to do academia. I actually wanted to be a pilot. Specifically an RAF pilot, and they recommended that you had a degree. I chose physics I thought it was relevant, you know, the fluid dynamics and mechanics and whatnot. But also I'd read that it was the most employable degree. So it was sort of as a kind of backup. If I didn't get into the RAF, you know, I could do that. And then I think it was, I don't know, it was a October Friday in my second year when I'd had my first lecture on laser physics and just the history of lasers and how they work. And I got really into that and decided I wanted to do a master's, and then it kind of just felt natural after that I wanted.
And where was that? Was that in UCL as well or somewhere else?
No, I went to the University of Hull. I was less academically minded during my A-levels, and I had other interests, basically, mostly video games. And so my A-levels were, you know, less than impressive. And in fact, the first 5, I had to apply through UCAS, which is the UK system for applying to university. And the first 5 universities I applied to, I didn't get in.
Wow.
So that was kind of a tough pill to swallow. I found out that I had a gap year that I wasn't really planning.
Did you try through clearing at all, or did you not bother with that?
No, I decided that I would get my act together first. I think I wanted to make sure that I wanted to go to university. I thought maybe, you know, this is a sign or something. And then ironically, I then spent a year working at UCL in a completely different capacity, but in the physics department, and basically got a free first-year education in physics, and, you know, fell deeply in love with it and decided I wanted to apply again. But my bars were more realistic this time. So I applied to Hull first, and the first one let me in. So I ended up at Hull, which ended up being great because I made some of the best friends of my life in Hull. And more importantly, for me anyway, academically wise, I really gelled with the teaching there. It was the research was not so much. I don't know how great the funding situation was in Hull, so they were really into their teaching. You know, my master supervisor was great. The guy running my teaching labs had a really, I think, novel view of teaching, in that, you know, students should actually learn something instead of just pass their exams. And I gelled really well with that, and ended up doing, you know, well. I got a first in my master's, and that enabled me to go and do a PhD at UCL. So it was kind of a natural progression for me.
So at what point in your first degree did you decide you were going to do a PhD?
It was just after my, I think I decided I wanted to do one before the end of my third year, but I decided to do a summer internship in industry first because I wanted to check that it was more, you know, attractive to me. because I feel like you should make informed decisions. So during the summer between my third and fourth year, so the end of my BSc and the start of my integrated masters, I did a summer internship, and I loved it. I did, but it was I think I was just more attracted to the idea of doing research at a university level, because it felt more free to me. I mean, at industry, there's a lot of money, but you're there to produce a product, really. And I wanted to do science. So I think it was in that summer that I decided the PhD was for me.
And how did you decide on a particular topic? I mean, I know you'd already been in physics, but I mean, how do you pin one down?
I think I'd chosen, there were other criteria for me. It wasn't just so much the subject itself. So obviously it was going to be physics for me anyway. As I mentioned before, I really am fascinated with lasers. And so I wanted to do something that it didn't necessarily have to be studying lasers or, about their applications, but I wanted to use them. So I wanted to be in a lab where they were present and I could, be around them. And then also I wanted to be in London. I grew up in London. I wanted to be closer to my family and some of my friends. So I knew I wanted to be in London, and then I wanted to sort of set my sights in the sort of higher up kind of universities, but to be honest, I didn't really mind. So I only applied to 2 PhDs. I applied to the one I'm in now at UCL and one at Imperial that was actually in the biophysics department, I think. And they were working on X-ray free electron lasers, which are huge, like warehouse style experiments. I think there's one in Germany, there's one in Japan, there's one in America. But the lab at UCL was doing all the prep work at Imperial was doing all the prep work for those experiments. That was kind of my process. I filled in all the criteria, and then I tried to be as flexible as possible within that criteria.
And you finally chose the one that you're doing. So tell us about the subject that you're actually researching at the moment then.
I very sort of, I do use lasers, but not, there's not so much focus on that. I do spectroscopy on positronium, which is an atom made from an electron and its antimatter counterpart, the positron. So at undergrad, they teach you that antimatter and matter annihilates immediately, and in some cases that's kind of true, but in other cases it's not true. Basically, it does. There is a process in between the annihilation where the 2 particles are bound in some state, and in the case of positronium, it can be a singlet or triplet state, which just means the spins of the particles are parallel or anti-parallel, and that can affect the lifetime. So if it's in the singlet state, it's 125 picoseconds. It's almost instantaneous.
Sorry, so this is, did you say an electron and a positron?
Yes, yeah.
And what stops them from, because I know one is positively charged and one is negatively charged, and the negative and the positive will attract each other. So what stops them from just immediately collapsing and annihilating each other? What stops them from doing that?
So they have some, I mean, they will do that. It doesn't.
Are they spinning or something, which is some centrifugal kind of force, or is that naive at that level?
No, I mean, they have some momentum, so they've got angular momentum just intrinsically because they're particles. But I'm trying to think about the best way to describe this. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. Is they have some angular momentum, so they'll orbit one another. They orbit a center of mass, but they do attract each other, and yes, they do annihilate.
So what's the lifetime of these positronium particles then, roughly?
Depending on whether the spins of the positron and electron are in the same direction or the opposite direction, it can be 125 picoseconds, which is
wow.
10 to the minus 12. Or the longer lived state is 145, no, 49 nanoseconds. So
Wow.
100 billionths of a second. But we can drastically increase that lifetime with the lasers. We excite them to higher energy states called Rydberg states. And then the lifetime is more like a microsecond.
Wow, microsecond.
Yeah. So for us, it's a long time.
You could also whiz around the cyclotron at close to the speed of light. That would extend the lifetime, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't know if that would extend the lifetime of the positronium.
Well, it ought to, because the relativity tells you that as the faster you get to the speed of light, the slower your clock goes.
That's true. Oh yeah, so I suppose it would extend the lifetime for us, but not for itself.
Well, yeah. As far as it's concerned, no, it's just the same.
But trapping positronium is quite difficult.
Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time talking about positronium, because it might have a limited interest to our own students. Let me ask you then. I mean, you're how far are you through your PhD now? Then
I just started my 3rd year.
Okay, so that's meant to finish in the 3rd year, isn't it?
Well, I think I've got 3.5.
Lucky you.
Yeah, lucky me.
But did you get a grant for that?
No. So I am a departmentally funded student.
Right.
So as far as I know, there's different ways of doing PhDs. You can fund yourself, which almost nobody does. You can apply for your own grant. That's rare, I think. More often than not, there's a job advert. Basically, you can go on, I think it's jobs.net, or you can just search PhDs, and like job websites will show you the advertisements. And then if you go to the websites for the institution you want to work at, there'll usually be a researcher section where there'll be job adverts. But yes, I think there's, in that sense, then either the principal investigator will have applied for funding and have the PhD student in the funding, or in my case, the department allocates certain amounts of PhD funding to the principal investigators.
And how much competition is there for these PhD kind of studentships? I mean, were you up against 50 candidates or 5 or what?
As far as I know, I was one of 3 that applied for this particular one. I think I was one of 3. It was me and 2 other guys from Oxford and Cambridge, I think.
Wow. So you'd say it was probably easier to get a PhD than it would be to get into a university as a degree.
Maybe. I don't know, though. I think so. For the principal investigator is perfectly within their rights to not accept anybody. If they're allocated a studentship and then 10 people apply and they don't want that student, then any of those students, then they can just say no. So I don't think it's certainly not worth thinking that it's easy, because I had to go through an interview process, and I had to do my CV and everything. It was like a normal job application.
What kind of interview? Did you have to do any, I don't know, demonstrations? Did you have to stand up and give a seminar, or was it just questions, or what?
I didn't. I know some PhD students do have to do that, and that's basically completely up to the supervisor. So in the case of my Imperial interview, it was 3 hours long. I spent an hour in the supervisor's office, and we went all the way through my degree and my CV and what I knew about their subject. And then I had a lab tour, and then it was quite a long process.
It was a technical interview, was it?
Yeah. I had to. They were asking me some quite hefty questions about their own research.
Right.
So I was pleased that I'd bothered to read it beforehand.
You made the effort to read up on it first.
Yeah, definitely. I would not be surprised if some people didn't, and they said, "Why are you applying to our PhD if you don't know anything about it?" With my current position, it was different. I think my supervisor wanted, I think he wanted more somebody that would fit with the group rather than somebody that was had already had the experience. I mean, there's very few positron beams. Well, I mean, there are quite a lot of positron beams, but there's almost no positronium beams. So the likelihood that a student would have the necessary technical experience was really low. So I think he more wanted somebody that would fit sort of socially with the group, and was eager to learn.
Yeah, sometimes those are the more important elements, aren't they? Whether you're with the team.
Yeah. And that, I mean, that's something I was looking for as well. And I think if you're applying for a PhD, same with any job, you should be looking for somewhere that you will fit in. And, if you like the supervisor, or if you like the environment or the other students, I would seriously suggest talking to the other students if you get a chance during the interview, either with or without the supervisor present, and just say, how do you feel about being here? Is it something that you find interesting? Is it something that you can see doing in the future? Things like that.
Right. And is there any teaching involved in your role? I mean, was that part of the interview, or was it just kind of a separate thing which you could add on or not add on as a choice, or the ideas appeal to you or not?
Yeah, so I do some teaching. We call it demonstrating rather than teaching.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's completely optional. There's no what's the word? You're not obligated to do it.
It's not mandated. Yes, it's not part of the process.
No.
So you get these options of doing some possible demonstrating, and then you presumably get paid for that.
Yeah, I get paid for that, and which is handy because we're currently in a, what do they call it, the cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
And PhD students, I mean, in London, I get the London living allowance still in my stipend, but before UKRI, which is the funding body, upped the student stipends, it was getting quite tight, paying rent and whatnot. So it's quite handy. I mean, that's a great way of picking up some extra cash, if that's your motivation. I more did it because, I mean, that obviously that's a good motivation, but I more did it because I really like teaching, and teaching the labs, or demonstrating rather the labs, is a really good. It's quite helpful for me actually, because I get to think about basic principles again, and I can sort of explain to students things and sort of work it out myself as well. So there'll be things that I do every day and I don't really remember why I do them every day. And so it's quite handy to then, teach that to students.
Yeah, to go back to first principles like that.
Mm.
So what's a typical day for you like then as a PhD student?
Well, that's the issue with experimental physics, is I don't really think there's a typical day so much. I think I sort of put it into two categories. There's sort of slow days and fast days, and there's not really a mix. So on a slow day, I would get in whatever time I get in. It's kind of lax. So because I work better this way, I like to get in around 10, and then I will spend half an hour trying to figure out what I want to do for the day, which is usually dependent on whatever I wrote in the lab book last night. So I try and at the end of the day write a little note to myself going, this is what I think I want to do tomorrow, and I'll check emails and stuff, and then I'll turn on, so we have two labs. The experiment that I'm working on is actually a helium beam. It's not the positronium beam, because, well, for various reasons. But that one is a lot smaller, and I can turn it off at the end of every day and turn it on at the beginning of the day, whereas the positronium beam is running all the time. So for me, I'll get into the lab and I'll set up the experiment. Has to warm up for 20 minutes, half an hour, and I can use that time to skim over a paper that I want to read or something like that. And then it'll be data taking mostly on a slow day all the way through the day, and then I'll finish when I feel I've come to a natural stopping point, and then I'll do the same another day. Then there are the fast days, which are um, days where either something goes wrong, or we're doing a big experiment rebuild. Like the positronium beam is huge. It's I don't know, 8-10 meters, something that's massive. And doing a rebuild takes a lot of time. You have to take apart all the chambers. You have to pump it up to atmosphere because it's all under vacuum. You have to move everything around, and so quite often I can be in the lab from 9-10 a.m. to 9-10 p.m. Just depending on what's gone wrong.
And you say you take a lot of data on the slow days. You must take an awful lot of data. What do you do with it all?
Well, so the positronium data, we're taking that basically 24/7. And that is largely due to statistics. We just need a lot of data to get rid of the background noise, and to make sure that the data we're taking is, so we do loads of averaging. So it would take us a week to do a line shape so we measure transitions between excited states in the positronium. And the way that you do that is you measure a line shape of the frequency, and then you can say the centroid frequency is the transition energy you need to excite that. With the positronium, that takes a week to get rid of all the statistics that we need. On the helium beam, I can do that in 120 seconds. So just because helium is massive, it's slow, and it doesn't annihilate on anything it touches. So there's plenty of it, and so I can take these line shapes and then decide what I need to change, like experimental parameters I need to change, and then I have to take more and more and more. Yeah, a lot of the data is just sort of optimization.
Right, but you're doing essentially the same experiment but with two different beams.
That's the plan. Yeah, that's the goal. So
the same answer.
Well, so they won't get the same answer because they're different systems. But the helium, we kind of want to use that. I mean, it's interesting in of itself, helium, partly because it's extremely well known mathematically. So the experiment should be well described by theory. But also because it's so nice to work with, we can build systems in the helium beam that should work for the positronium beam. So we can build up methods, we can sort of generate processes that we can then do with the positronium.
How do you generate, not generate, how do you move, what's the word I'm thinking of? How do you make a beam out of helium? How do you, I mean, it's neutral, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if it was an alpha particle, which was just before, then you can accelerate it, can't you, through charged plates? How do you accelerate a helium beam?
So we used a pulsed valve. So we've just got a valve basically, and then on one side is vacuum. So we pump it down to -8 millibar, something like that. So really low. And then on the other side we have 2 bar, so twice the atmosphere of helium, just neutral helium, and then we pulse this valve. So we open the valve, and the valve is built in such a way that you get something called an effusive beam, which is that, or rather a supersonic effusive beam, which is that helium doesn't really know the difference between being in the valve and out of the valve, and has the same translational velocity in and out. And so basically you end up with a really large horizontal velocity because it was at very high pressure and now it's at super low pressure.
Yeah.
And then
these 2 chambers are like an old Maxwell demon kind of picture where they just fly out then.
Yeah, you just open up the valve and they just shoot out. And then we have a filament, which is like an old light bulb, that injects electrons into the gas, and we make a plasma with that. And then some of the plasma recombines into excited states. So we get excited states for free, basically.
And what's your PhD title? Have you got one specific?
That changes every few months. The current working title is Microwave and Millimeter Wave Spectroscopy of Simple Atomic Systems. I suspect that will change again very soon. But yeah, that's the current title.
You make the title fit the data, or does the data fit the title?
It's well, my PhD, like, it changed somewhat partly because I started in 2020. So I started my PhD in the height of the second lockdown. So the first lockdown, there's that brief month where there was no lockdown in June, and I used that month to move back to London from Hull. And then I started my PhD, and I wasn't allowed in the lab for 6 months. So the trajectory of my PhD changed a bit. And then for other circumstances, I ended up going onto the helium beam, and so my PhD changed again. Yeah, it's more that the title is fitting the data in this case.
Okay. And what would you say, I mean, looking back over your 2.5 years or more now that you've been doing this, what's been your biggest challenge, taking everything into account? Is it, the teaching? Is it the laboratories? Is it getting to know systems, people? What's the biggest challenge?
Honestly, it's time management is my biggest challenge. There's so much that I want to do. There's so much that I feel that I need to do. And there's so much that I just think would be cool to do. And I really struggle with the time management thing. So like I think you need to fit in time to read papers so that you can keep up to date. You need to have dedicated writing time. Then there's the lab time. Then there's, you've got to decide whether or not you need to decide where your work-life balance is as well. So I will work most weekends. But
so how much freedom do you get when you do a PhD?
I think that depends on the supervisor. I also think it depends on the system. So if you're working somewhere like CERN, for example, you might not be able to spend all night there. But then there are other experiments like the X-Files I mentioned. You only get a certain amount of beam time. So you'd have a month maybe of beam time in the whole year. So you spend a month working 13-hour days, and then you get 2 weeks holiday or whatever. So I think it honestly depends on the system you're working on. I get a lot of freedom in the sense that I can choose when to be in and when not to be in. Usually I choose to be in.
That's your way of managing time, I suppose, by being in.
I have no idea how I manage time. I think time manages me, to be honest.
Yeah. And do you have you attended any lectures from the point of view of learning? I mean, was that necessary as part of your course early on, or did you have to bring yourself up to scratch by yourself by just reading papers, or could you go to courses?
So I've been to a conference in May, and that was just a week of lectures all in the sort of area that I'm studying. And then my department also put up weekly seminars. And so we get to go to those, and there'll be sometimes internal speakers, sometimes external speakers. And so you get to see kind of what's going on in the area. But I mean, before my PhD, I'd never heard of a positronium. And I had to,
what, sorry?
Positronium.
Positronium, all right.
I had to get myself up to speed entirely. And so I think my first port of call is usually to, Google the name of what I'm looking up and then review. And if you can find a literature review, that's a really great start, because somebody has already basically made notes and then summarized the literature for however many years. And then from that, you can get a decent sort of starting point.
Yeah.
And then they've also pointed you towards all the sort of notable names in that area. So
review papers are very good if they're done well. They can be a good shortcut. I remember when I did my PhD, I first started, and the advice I was given was to go along to the various lectures. You know, I was in London. Go along to whichever lectures you took your fancy, which was, you know, they said there's John Taylor in King's College. He's giving on electrodynamics. And there's Tom Kibble over at Imperial College. Go along to his lectures, and you find them out, and you drop in, and you ask if you don't mind you sitting in the back. That's fine. And I learned a lot that way. I also learned a lot that I knew I couldn't learn because it was quite complicated stuff. Some of this, which I thought was incredibly difficult. Maybe they were talking to the wrong person, but anyway, there was some complicated stuff that actually wasn't that useful to me anyway. But you had the whole of London University's physics departments available to you, it seemed to me, and you could just drop in and you know, see what you liked. That was quite.
I'm sure I could still do that if I wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's quite. I think academics generally are quite good if you just want to email them and say, can I come and have a look at your lab, or can I sit in your lectures, can I talk to one of your students? Every academic I've emailed so far has been very accommodating.
Yeah, I think that's generally true, and I think it's a, you know, a good area to take advantage of if you're able to do so. Coming to the end, Sam, you've got to go and do some teaching yourself or so. What would you say to somebody who was maybe doing a master's now, thinking about possibly doing a PhD in the future, contemplating that move? What advice would you give? What would you tell them to look out for? What would you tell them to avoid?
I think I would say make sure that it is something that you want to do, because it's a big commitment. You're doing basically another degree. I would also say be flexible. So I think I've benefited hugely from going into a subject that I really didn't know anything about. I mean, I knew about atomic physics, I knew, you know, about spectroscopy, but I really didn't know anything about the particulars of what was going on. And I've basically got a whole new community of people that I can talk to, and what I want to do next has changed a lot. So, for instance, I'm really toying with the idea of going to do a postdoc overseas now, and I don't know if that would have been an option for me if I'd been in my comfort zone, let's say. So I'd say, you know, make sure that it's something you want to do, but at the same time, really don't be afraid to try something completely new. And I know people that have gone from their master's to a PhD in another country, and it's been the best decision they've ever made. So I think be flexible, and then if you decide that you do want to do a PhD, apply to more than one, so that you get a feel for what sort of the community is like, and then make sure that you have options for you as well. It's not, you know, they're not just interviewing you, you're interviewing them. And then if you get through the interview process and you haven't started drinking coffee yet, then start. Always keep a pack of biscuits in your top drawer. And yeah, I think get into good habits fast. So things like make sure you have time, even if it's just half an hour every day, where you sit at your laptop or your office PC or something and you just read for that half an hour. Or if you don't read, you just stare at your laptop for half an hour, but you don't do anything else. You know, don't have your phone, don't have your lab book. Just have that time that's just for reading, and the same for writing. You know, you can only stare at your laptop for so long before you start doing something. So, but get into good habits fast, I think, would be good advice.
Thank you. And looking to the future, my final question is: what do you see for yourself in the future? Are you looking for an academic career, or are you looking for something else?
I think short term, I'd like to stay in research. Definitely. I'm I love what I do now, and I want to do more of that. And I think I'd like to do that internationally as well. Longer term, I'm extremely passionate about teaching. I'd love to teach physics, and the sort of realistic side of me says the best way to do that is to be, an academic, so a lecturer or something. I'd like to teach degree level physics. The sort of imaginative version thinks that I'll be the next Brian Cox, or write a book.
Well, why not? Why not?
Yeah, exactly.
You have to put yourself out there in order to do that and make a bit of a name yourself. But you're talking about teaching at university level rather than, say, teaching at school level, sixth form, something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think university level, but then maybe do some outreach or something. So, but at the end of the day, I'll be a teacher, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of opportunities outside of the university. I'm thinking of the Royal Institution. They're always looking for people to volunteer to do teaching and particularly disseminate the knowledge downwards, which is always good. It sort of opens up a whole pile of possibilities for you. The only thing which is the downside that I remember from reading some research is that people who get paid, people who do PhDs tend to get paid less than people doing masters.
Yeah,
bear that in mind too, because an academic career is tend to be what people go for in who do PhDs, and they don't get paid quite as well as industry will pay.
that's true. That's true. But there are other benefits, and thankfully, I've been a student for so long that I know how to live frugally. So,
yes, I remember one of my old student friends used to live incredibly frugally. He'd just buy a loaf of bread and a block of cheese at the beginning of the week and make that last him to the end of the week.
oh,
Basically, his diet every week. But anyway,
I might try that. That sounds good.
Well, it's not to be recommended for too long, I shouldn't think.
Probably not.
Sam, thank you ever so much for your time. It's been very interesting talking to you. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope that you found it interesting too. But I'm sure my students will find it interesting as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.